Okay, our next speaker is Alex Main. Went to Stanford University, majored in computational and mathematical engineering. His advisor was Charbel Farhat. Did his practicum at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and his presentation title is Implicit and Higher Order Discretization Methods for Multi-Material Problems. Let's welcome Alex.
Yeah, so thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the work I did as part of my thesis, which I finished up, I guess, 7 months ago, and I'm now postdocing at Duke, doing some similar work. So we're going to talk about a little bit of a different tack from what a lot of the presenters have been talking about, and talk about computational modeling. And so my thesis topic was on fluid structure interaction and multi-fluid problems, and how you can simulate them on a computer. So for example, one problem that I think is particularly interesting and is relevant, I think, to a lot of the difficult problems that we talked about earlier, for example, would be an underwater implosion explosion problem, where, for example, you have an underwater blast that causes high pressures and could cause a structure to collapse. Another example would be a pipeline explosion, where, if, for example, you have a weakness or some other flaw that the gas inside the pipeline could cause the metal to expand, the metal to rupture. And so the question is, how can you simulate these? And it's a real problem, to be able to predict what's going to happen with these complicated systems in order to do the design and ensure that they don't fail. But to do it on a computer, so as to make to reduce the cost, so that you don't have to do all of these experiments constantly. So let me talk about what I would call a multi-material problem. I have, for example, multiple fluids and multiple solids. I treat them all as immiscible, meaning that the particular problems that I'm interested in, you don't have mixing of phases. So you have very distinct fluids and very distinct solids. But the solids and the fluids can all move around. They can touch each other, not touch, and the solids can fracture. So what's challenging about simulating these problems? Well, one, because you have multiple subsystems, you have multiple timescales, and that's also true for the experimentalist. But you also have numerical instabilities that appear as a result of the necessity of coupling these multiple subsystems together. Further, you can have topological changes in your systems. For example, a lot of times structures may crack or break, and you have to simulate not that cracking and breaking process, but then also allow, of course, the fluid to be able to penetrate those holes that open up. And of course, typically, because especially for these problems, we have explosions and implosions, you have high velocity flow. Of course, shocks are a necessary component, and typically your material models are quite complicated. But most importantly, you have moving boundaries. Typically, because these problems are nonlinear and you have high-speed flow, the boundaries between your subsystems are not static, but rather they tend to move around. And in order to appropriately resolve the physics, you have to account for the fact that these boundaries can move. So a brief overview, if you all are not familiar with how you handle computational simulations for problems involving moving boundaries, there are two typical methods, one called ALE, arbitrary Lagrangian Eulerian, and the second called Eulerian methods. in an arbitrary Lagrangian Eulerian method, the mesh is allowed to, or your mesh is allowed to track the subsystem boundaries. And so your mesh actually deforms with your subsystem. In the Eulerian approach, you define a mesh that remains static through the simulation, and that allow the boundaries between the subsystems to move through the mesh. The disadvantage of the Ale approach is that meshing becomes quite complicated because it turns out you can have this problem where the mesh tangles and inverts. The problem with Eulerian methods is that they're quite difficult to develop because it's not clear how to enforce the boundary conditions at these subsystem boundaries that no longer conform to your mesh. So a brief outline of the things I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about the particular method that I worked on as part of the research group, as part of my thesis for simulating multi-material flows. And I'll talk about how this particular method can be applied to do implicit time stepping, even for problems that are involving implosions. And then talk about how we can obtain second-order accuracy for this particular method, and then talk about briefly how it can be made to be stable. So what is an embedded boundary method? An embedded boundary method is one where we have, for example, you'd have a mesh here in black on the bottom, which is, it could be, not necessarily, but it could be, say, very nice and rectangular. We have a structure where it could be a fluid-fluid boundary in black, and that is embedded within the mesh, hence the name of the embedded method. And then we have nodes where, in this case, for example, it would be an airfoil, but I'm not doing any airfoil problems, but this is just to show you. The red nodes would be, say, where we would compute our solution, the airflow, and the green nodes are inside. We'd call them ghost nodes, and they're completely meaningless. And you can see immediately why this is advantageous, as I alluded to earlier, because it's very easy to generate a mesh for this problem, because in this case, for example, it'd be simply just a two-dimensional grid. The problem with an embedded boundary method is, how do you enforce the boundary conditions on the surface? Because it's not clear a priori what the boundary conditions should be. So most of the work I'm going to be presenting here is all inviscid and immiscible. So we're going to assume the Euler equations hold for the system. And so if we take our Euler equations and then write down the usual finite volume form for the Euler equations, we have our usual terms, the time derivative, far field terms. These are the fluxes between individual cells. And then this term here is normally your contribution from the boundary conditions. And so the essence of the FIVER method, which is an embedded boundary method for multi-material flows, is how do you approximate this term. So the way we do this, is to look and treat the actual embedded boundary where between a node that's, say, a real node that's in the fluid and a ghost node that's either inside a solid or it's of another fluid, or somehow that there's an embedded boundary between the two particular nodes. Usually if there were no boundary, we would just do a standard finite volume flux, for example, a rho flux or something of that effect. But the question is, okay, well, what do we do? What do we do here? And so we make a couple of approximations first to make this problem tractable, which I'm going to remove later when I talk about how we obtain second-order accuracy. And the first is I'm just going to assume, to make things easier on ourselves to think about, we're going to assume that the interface is not where it actually is, but it actually always conforms to the boundary of these cells. And so, yes, of course, we're making an order H error, but we'll correct that later. And then what we do is we would solve what's known as an exact Riemann problem between the two. In this case, I have a fluid boundary here, fluid 1 here on the left and fluid 2 on the right. And we would construct an exact Riemann problem at this boundary that we've assumed is right here, which gives us a solution in this region. And then we use that solution to compute the flux. So for example, usually if we go back, our flux takes a form like Wj, where this is Wj and Wj plus 1. These are the two inputs for our flux. Well, we take the solution we obtain and then put that solution directly into our flux function. And that gives us a numerical flux at the boundary. And this is the flux that we use. And it turns out you can show that by doing this, by computing the fluxes in this manner, you enforce the boundary conditions up to a certain order, to a reasonable approximation, we'll say. The other advantage of doing it this way by simply replacing the values is that, if for example, we have a topological change, let's say our boundary cracks or it becomes permeable or something like this, it's really easy to compute, to figure out how the method is robust in terms of those changes, because what was, say if the structure cracks, this between these two nodes, originally we were treating this as a fluid structure boundary, but now instead of computing the flux as though it's a fluid structure boundary, we just compute it as though it's a fluid boundary. But that's simply a one-line code change to say, okay, well, now this edge is, goes through the hole in the structure. Now I just treat it as a fluid boundary. So let me just show you, what we can do with this method. Whoops. Sorry. So this is an example of we had an underwater blast. Down at the left, and we have an air-filled structure here in the middle, and then it's underwater, so you can see as the blast wave, which propagated right before the video started, causes the structure to implode, and you see the piece of the structure which cracks off and then gets pushed inward. And so this actually, you can see, is a very complicated problem because you have the high pressure water, you have the air which is initially at a low pressure, you have the explosion which we simulated, which is down, which you can't see, and then you have the structure which is flexible and can crack. So then one of the things I worked on in my thesis is, well, can we do such simulations, or do we have to do them using explicit time stepping? And that explicit time stepping is the generally easiest thing that you can do for these sorts of problems, but it tends to be quite computationally intensive. And so the question is, are there simulations for which you can get away by doing implicit time stepping in order to reduce the computational cost? So there are a couple of challenges to do this because within an Eulerian framework, typically then, because we're implicit, at every time step we have to solve a nonlinear system of equations of this form. Now, in order to solve this system of equations efficiently, first we needed Jacobians of the exact Riemann problems that we use to compute the fluxes. And we have an additional problem, which is a little bit technical, but the question is, because a particular location in space, used to be of one type of fluid, then it could be another type of fluid, then it could be a solid. And the question is, well, we need a partial derivative. We need the derivative of the state with respect to time. How can we estimate the time derivative of that state if, what does dp dt even mean? Or what does, d energy dt even mean if the particular node has, used to be a metal and now it's a gas, right? But saying, that doesn't make any sense. So what we did is we found a way to resolve this by, if we end up in a situation like that, we kind of construct an odd shape, we kind of look at backwards in time and figure out, what's the actual, nearest point backwards in time that's, of the same phase, so that, then we can construct a different stencil, between all fluids of the same type. The details of this are in a paper that was published in JCP last year. JCP is Journal of Computational Physics. I realize that none of y'all probably are familiar with that one. So as an example, this is a problem that I think it was simulated at Newark Naval Undersea Warfare Center maybe 10 years ago. And you have a high-pressure water tank, an initial air-filled bubble here in the middle, and you have a little sensor. And then you let this glass kind of crack and be obliterated, and then this low-pressure air bubble in the middle will collapse and then expand due to the high-pressure water. We want to demonstrate the capabilities of the implicit time stepping on this particular problem. So just comparing, this is the pressure contours. On the left, we have the original explicit time stepping method. On the right, we have the implicit time stepping method. And see that qualitatively, they look very, very similar. You can see the low pressure air bubble in the middle collapses at time t0 to the high pressure outside. And then once the bubble reaches its minimum radius, it re-expands, causing the pressure wave, here in a minute, there we go, to send out. And then, on our sensor, which is actually, it's not a real, well, they had a sensor, you can see the pressure spike due to this wave here. So comparing, for example, the original explicit time stepping scheme, which is kind of the easiest thing to do, which is in blue, and then the implicit scheme, which is in green, which you can't see. You can't actually see it because it's actually underneath actually almost on top of the explicit time stepping scheme. So we get nearly the exact same results. And you can see that compared to the experimental data, we're pretty close. We overestimate the peak a little bit in our computational experiment. But still, we felt that overall this is pretty good agreement with the experimental results. And when we look at computational time, you see that between the two methods, comparing the same order of accuracy for the time integrators, the implicit time stepping scheme is almost 20 times faster, which is quite an improvement. Now, as I said before, if we go back, I mentioned that we made an approximation assuming that the material boundary conforms to the cell boundaries because it would make things easier. And we said, okay, well, that introduces an order of H error. So the question is, how can we get rid of this error that we made and make our method truly second order accurate? These results, our treatment of the numerical interface is actually first order accurate. Even now we're actually mesh converged and we still get good answers, but we're still interested in can we make our method more accurate at the interface in order to reduce the computational cost. So the way we do this, remember that the method relies on the construction of exact Riemann problems at this boundary right here. Well, instead, now we drop that assumption, and now we construct our exact Riemann problems right here at the true boundary. And the way we do that is first, for example, we take the state here, we do a linear extrapolation to the true boundary here, solve an exact Riemann problem to get the solution which remember we plugged into the flux function, and then we interpolate backwards back to this interface here, and then we compute the physical flux. Now, to describe that, it's a little bit complicated. I can explain in more detail later. But it turns out this allows us to obtain second order accuracy while remaining stable. And then, of course, I didn't mention this before, but of course, because we have moving boundaries, it's possible that your interface could cross a node. For example, one node could be. This is a problem that only occurs with Eulerian methods, does not occur with Arrow methods. A particular node in your computational mesh, let's say this one, it's a pink fluid right now, but this boundary could move from here to here over the course of the simulation, in which case now this really should be a green fluid instead of a pink fluid. And so what we do in that case is we simply, again, do a linear extrapolation from this node to give, when that situation occurs, do a linear extrapolation from this node to this node in order to give an estimate for the fluid state when that occurs. We're looking into methods to kind of remove that extrapolation process because we think it's not particularly physical, but it seems to work reasonably well nonetheless. As an example problem, one of the things we love to do as mathematicians is to construct problems for which we know the exact solution. We can work out the exact solution by hand for this problem. And we just have two fluids, one on top of the other, immiscible. And it has an exact solution. We can look at the order of accuracy. So as we can plot the error in our computation against the how dense our mesh is. And we can see for the original method, which I described at the beginning of the talk, our error, as the mesh becomes refined, kind of tails off. And you see, for the same mesh density, the second order method has a much lower overall error than the original method. Now this is for explicit time stepping. For implicit time stepping, we get the same result. We still get second order accuracy. So just I'm going to go a little faster now. This is just because we're based on interpolation and extrapolation. We're interested in are we nonlinearly stable? Will we generate oscillations? Because we're interested in things when shocks move, complicated physics. Well, it turns out the particular method I just showed you, based purely on linear extrapolation at the material interface, you get these nasty little oscillations here and here. And of course, as you know, the solution should be straight. It just should be straight right here and here. So one of the things we developed, we constructed a limiter for these linear extrapolations. And once you go through all the math, what happens is, we can obtain, even for these non-smooth problems, we can suppress these oscillations to a very large degree to get a physically reasonable solution. And of course, when we construct the limiter to limit the oscillations, we want to show, okay, does this limiter degrade our order of accuracy? Of course, if we say, okay, great, we're nonlinearly stable, we don't have oscillations, our solution looks really smooth, but we're first order accurate, we're back in this situation, which is bad, which is what we don't want. We don't want this case because, we want to have a very low error for reasonably dense mesh. We don't want to, if we were to say, okay, I want 10 to the minus 8 error, I would have to go, with this method, I would have to go all the way over here, which would be, a mesh size of 10 to the minus 3 for this, or 10 to the minus 4 for this case. So we want to check to make sure that these limiters that we have don't destroy our order of accuracy for smooth problems. So it's just showing we have original method again. This is a smooth problem. The original second unlimited extension with no limiter, and then the extension with the limiter applied, we see that we lose. We have the identical rate of convergence and actually conveniently almost the same absolute order of accuracy. So just in conclusion, I described a robust framework for the simulation of multi-material flow with multiple fluids and multiple solids, with a particular emphasis on implosions and explosions when things are under high pressure. Described how this scheme can be extended with implicit time stepping in order to reduce the computational cost, and described how we obtain second order accuracy with this scheme. Future work and some work that's in progress, implementation on vector processors in order to compute very, very large scale problems with an eye towards trillions or more flops. And then, of course, complex equations of state so that we can model more sophisticated materials. Any questions?